Hello, welcome everybody on the Zoom and in the in-person audience. So I'm Claire Lefort, I'm the director of the Parks Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker today, and Tony Kushner, Professor Tony Kushner, who will be chairing tonight's lecture, Howard Rein lecture, and we have a nice audience from Bournemouth in the room. So yes, up to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Claire, and welcome everybody. Welcome to the audience who have braved the stormy weather, and it's great to see everyone, especially Corinne and Annabelle representing Howard's family. First of all, I'll say a few words about Howard. Howard Rein was a master's student here and then a PhD student here, and was very, very much part of the Parks Institute family with Corinne, a regular attender of our events, and just a wonderful person to have as part of our team. Supervising Howard was one of the most pleasurable experiences in my academic career of a few years, a couple of years or 36, depending on the truth. And Howard was just wonderful to have around. He was a very, very dedicated GP in Leeds, where he trained, and his place of birth, and then in Bournemouth, where he settled with his family. And it was on medical history that both within his MA dissertation and then his PhD, which was on a comparison of the German hospital in London and the Jewish hospital in London, that he focused. And it was a superb piece of medical history and comparative migration history. And I, as a total non-medic, learned an awful lot. And Howard's ability to sort of master a new discipline of history, but also to bring his medical expertise was really inspiring. But more than anything, Howard was just an absolute mensch, a lovely person, and his untimely death was something that we still recovering from. But we've had a series of really distinguished lectures in Howard's memory, ranging from antiquity through to the modern period, and we're going to fast forward to the later modern period, largely the 20th century, this evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce Todd Endelman. Todd has been an inspiration to those of us working in Anglo-Jewish history. He did his PhD work here on British Jewish social history. It was an area that was almost totally uncharted. Recently, I've been working on a story from the 18th century on a Jewish triple murderer in rural England. And it gave me the chance to revisit Todd's work, his early work. And I sort of remembered the Jews of Georgian England, which I've used as a teaching tool, but I remember it being an outstanding book. But rereading it, it is really annoyingly brilliant. There is just almost nothing left to be done when you've read this book. And it was published, I think, in 1980, but it is 40 odd years on. It is still absolutely perfect in every way, beautifully written, as all Todd's work is, but just so perceptive in a field that was totally empty beforehand. But Todd since then has done so many different important studies. He's written an overview of British Jewish history. And those of us who've worked in this field, Todd has been a sort of inspiration from abroad, helping a younger generation of scholars. And we're now not so young anymore. We're all sort of edging towards retirement, but we owe an awful lot to Todd. He's written on Jewish social history, a set of really interesting and innovative essays broadening Jewish history. on radical assimilation in English Jewish history, and a wide-ranging book on Jews leaving the fold, on those that converted to Christianity. So that range of scholarship, he is one of the leading scholars of Jewish history across the world. But his particular input into Anglo-Jewish history has been invaluable in a very neglected area of study. His latest book, which we're going to hear from, has a connection to James Parks, that Redcliffe Salaman had a connection to the same part of the world. And Todd has used the archives here extensively, has been very much part of the community. One of the, seems a perverse thing to say, one of the nice aspects of lockdown was that we could see Todd regularly on Zoom. And that was a very reassuring sort of presence to see him amongst other scholars, but that he was fine and he was still contributing to us. And he's been so helpful to us in the Parks Institute over many years. And that again is deeply appreciated. So tonight, to give tonight's Howard Rein Memorial Lecture, we have Todd speaking on a Jewish race scientist in 20th century Britain. Todd.
Thank you, Tony. That was very kind. Could you put on the title page, the first slide? I'm very happy to be here in person because I haven't been cut off so long because of the COVID pandemic. It's a real treat to speak to people, although I understand that many more of you are seeing me on Zoom than are here in the audience. I'm going to be talking about race scientists, and a particular race scientist in Britain, a man named Redcliffe Salaman, who I'm going to be talking about. But let me start with, first of all, a portrait of Salaman, so you'll know what he looked like. It's slide 2. Good. This is a portrait that William Rothenstein did of the young Salaman. And I'll be explaining what the setting for the picture was in a little bit. Now, as we all know, in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, race thinking was ubiquitous, both in Europe and America. The very term race thinking is itself somewhat vague because racial thinking itself was vague. But at bottom, what it meant was a belief that humankind is divided into different races, that these races are different in essence from each other, and that any individual's own characteristics are in fact descended from and dependent on the race to which he or she belongs. That is one's character, one's abilities, one's emotions, one's sentiments, etc. Also one's intelligence, we could also add. That all of these are dependent on race. It's another way of saying that biology was destiny, both for individuals and for nation states. Now, the thing to understand about race thinking is that it permeated high and low culture. It was everywhere. It was in sermons, it was on the stage, it was in newspaper articles. It was in the nascent social sciences. It was in the physical sciences, and you found it throughout political and cultural discourse. Now, it usually, but not always, include a belief in the hierarchy of races. That is, that races were not just different from each other, because in itself that implies no hierarchy, but this kind of race thinking usually did include a hierarchy, where one race was thought to be superior to another, and certainly most European accounts put Europeans at the top of the ladder. Now, it's popular sometimes to dismiss a race science as pseudoscience, and sometimes even put quotation marks around it, as if to suggest, well, this is really just a bunch of claptrap. It has no real intellectual worth. Whatever its scientific worth, it was the science of the time. And I don't want to call it a pseudoscience, because that will suggest to you incorrectly that it was something that was marginal, that it was just for eccentrics, or people with a bee in their bonnet on the extremes of society. It wasn't, it was mainstream. And so I'm not going to call it a pseudoscience. Rather, it was incorporated into mainstream scientific thinking. Now, everywhere, for Jewish scientists, this was a particular problem. As racial thinking was a particular problem because most race scientists who were not Jews posited that Jews were not part of the most highly ranked race, but belonged to an inferior race. And this called into question the abilities, the bona fides of Jewish scientists. How could they work in the sciences if they belonged to an inferior race, if they didn't possess the kinds of attributes that those who belonged to the dominant race did? Now, there were various ways to challenge this if one was a Jewish scientist. One was to say, well, yes, the humankind is divided into races, but there's the hierarchy as it's commonly posited is not correct. In fact, there are some races that may be higher than others, but not as the Nordic race scientists think, but in fact, it's something else. And they would oftentimes rearrange the hierarchy of races and the racial traits that were commonly assigned to them. Now, Redcliffe Salaman's solution was a little bit different. He embraced the notion of race, but not in the conventional way, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And my starting point, oddly enough, is going to be a family crest that he had designed in 1923. This may seem a strange way to connect race science, but I need to explain something. Redcliffe Salaman was obsessed throughout his life with two things that ostensibly have nothing to do with each other: potatoes and Jews. And you can see this on the family crest. Now, he never used the family crest. He asked a major figure in designing family crests and stained glass windows in London to draw up a family crest. And of course, he told him what he wanted in it. And in this picture, you will see his two main interests of both Judaism and particularly Zionism are represented, as are potatoes. You see the potato plants there in the middle. And then, of course, it says, let there be light by Eeyore, including his role as a scientist, and of course, the reference of the menorah to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, what do these two have together? It was his scientific work with potatoes that led to him to write or to construct a biological history of the Jews. So I need to explain this. I have to do it first by providing some background about Salaman. Salaman was born in 1876. In that sense, he's a late Victorian, although he lived into the middle of the 20th century. He was born into a very wealthy London Jewish family. He was one of 15 siblings. For about a 20-year period, his mother did nothing but give birth to children. The family was mildly traditional in the Anglo-Jewish way. That is, they belonged to a traditional synagogue. They observed some of the laws of kashrut, and they observed some of the holidays, but not the second days of the holiday. His father was in the ostrich feather business, Meyer Salaman. Ostrich feathers were very important in fashion in the 19th century, increasingly so as we moved toward World War I. They were an essential part of any well-dressed woman's fashionable outfit, and they were also well used by colonial officials and military officers in various kinds of dress uniforms. In any case, his father was the third generation of Salaman to be in the ostrich feather business. His grandfather had started it, initially importing ostrich feathers by way of Livorno from North Africa, mainly from Morocco. Later, they imported them from South Africa and directly to London, and London became one of the great centers of the ostrich feather trade, and the Salaman family business was one of the great pillars of the ostrich feather trade. As I said, his father made good money in the ostrich feather trade. He made a fantastic amount of money when he went into property. He is the only 19th century Jew I know of who invested the money he made in London property. And he started buying up property in very many places are familiar to you, including Oxford Street and the Strand and the City, in Islington and elsewhere. And this is what made him so wealthy. And Redcliffe Salaman received the education and the upbringing of a gentleman. He was sent to a preparatory school. He then went to St. Paul's. He went to Trinity Hall, Cambridge, where he read natural sciences. Go to the next slide, please. This is Redcliffe Salaman as a medical student. He trained as a physician at the London Hospital, which is in the East End. He was there in the late 1890s. He chose the East End for a very specific reason. His father had been very generous and very concerned with Jewish problems. Redcliffe himself wanted to see the immigrants at first hand. So that's part of what attracted him to the East End. He specialized eventually in pathology, studied for 2 years, did more advanced work in pathology in Germany. The state of pathology in Britain was not high, and so he went to Germany. On his return from Germany, he worked as the pathologist at the London Hospital, directing their pathology department. But this came to an end in 1904 when he contracted tuberculosis, or at least what was thought to be tuberculosis. In either case, he was treated as tuberculosis. He was sent off to Switzerland. He spent 6 months in the Alps there doing nothing, except reading and sitting in the sun. And then he returned to London. But he could not return to work because it was thought to throw him back himself in that same kind of atmosphere, environment in which he contracted TB would be dangerous. And so he had to search for something to do. He also had to find a new home. He and his wife decided to settle in the country. If you could do the next 3 slides, please. So he ended up finding a country home, which he called Homestall, in the little village of Barley, which is in East Hertfordshire, but it's very close to Cambridge, only about 12 miles from Cambridge. Salaman was not the kind of person who would be content simply to hunt and get involved in county affairs like the JP, working as a JP. He wanted something to do, and he looked about for something to do in the scientific field. And what he did was he contacted William Bateson, who was at one of the Cambridge colleges, which was nearby. Bateson was in the process of reviving interest in Mendelian genetics, or Mendelian inheritance studies. And Mendel, as you may know, if you remember in experiments about peas, was concerned with how biological characteristics are inherited. That is, from one generation of peas to the next generation of peas, and so on. And the laws governing this, he used the concepts of dominance and recessive. Certain traits were dominant, certain traits were recessive. Now, what Redcliffe did was fine. He adopted this kind of outlook of Mendel's, and he began to experiment at home, at his own home, in Homestall. You could use the next 2, maybe the next one as well. I should point out that it's probably the only country home in Britain that has a shin still on its as a weather vane. And it's backwards here because the angle it was turned when the wind was blowing. And I should also say, if you know anything about Nicholas Pevsner's guide to the buildings of England, Pevsner mentions the building and some of its unique arts and crafts aspects, particularly one wing. He says nothing about the shin. And as you may know, Pevsner was a converted Jew who didn't want anyone to know he was Jewish. And some people described him as as at least a neo-Nazi for a couple of years when he first arrived in Britain. In any case, he doesn't mention it. So he bought this house and he began doing experiments, scientific experiments that we would today recognize as genetic experiments. And they involved breeding. Now, at this time, to conduct science, one did not need any university or research institute. There were still gentlemen scientists who did their work in their own homes, and it didn't require grants from universities or foundations or drug companies or anything to carry out research. So taking advice from Bateson and borrowing various kinds of things to breed, he bred, and this is in the order he tried them, butterflies, rhinoceros skin mice, guinea pigs, breeded combless poultry, and he also, the last thing before he got onto potatoes, was hair samples of people from Papua, and then also children from there who were the offspring of Europeans and Papuans. And he tried all these, but it didn't work out for whatever reason. He then began to work with potatoes. Next, please. And this is with him with a potato in his hand, in the middle of his potato garden. This is probably after he had retired. He settled on potatoes at the suggestion of his gardener. It turned out to be a real blessing, partly because the contributions he made. He discovered ways of breeding blight-free potatoes. He found potatoes that had no blight in them, seemed to be resistant to blight. These tended to be strains of wild potatoes that came from Peru and elsewhere in Latin America. And he bred them together with British breeds of potatoes, and he was able to achieve eventually some blight-free varieties. This was very important work. Even in the early 20th century, Britain every year was losing millions of pounds to potato blight, let alone the incident of the 19th century in Ireland. And he was widely recognized for this. Eventually, in the 1920s, the government funded a research station for him to carry out his research on potatoes. And he worked there till 1939 when he had to retire at the mandatory age of 65. And he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society in 1935 in recognition of his work. Now, how do we get from potatoes to Jews? Before the 19-teens, Salaman did not show any particular interest in the racial character of Jews. As an adolescent, he once referred to himself as a racial Jew, particularly after he read Disraeli's Tancred. And Salaman believed as a young man, even before he began his research, that Jews were a race and referred to them as such, but it didn't have any greater meaning. He didn't work on it in any way. It was a particular Proustian moment, not with a Madeleine though, that led him from potatoes to Jews. In 1910, he was sitting at his breakfast table at his home in Barley, and he opened a letter from his brother Clement. And the letter conjured up an image of Clement in his mind. Clement, his non-Jewish Scottish wife, and their 5 children. And Redcliffe Salaman realized that there was nothing Jewish looking either in Clement or in any of their appearances. And he said Clement Salaman could pass as a prize Nordic. Those were his words. And it was this leap from potato genetics to what he imagined human genetics to be. They didn't use the term genetics. They didn't have the notion of genes at the time, that led him in his way. Now, he was really involved in 2 projects. And I'm talking about intellectual projects now. One was how characteristics were inherited among Jews. That is how certain characteristics, markers, were passed on from one generation to the next. And he was interested in constructing a biological history of Jews. And I'll explain what that means in a bit. Let's start with the first one, the inheritance of characteristics. Now, clearly, he couldn't breed Jews, okay? Life strands too long. He would be gone before he see any results. So what did he do? What he did was he gathered pictures of Jewish families of multiple generations. He particularly wanted pictures also of Jewish families in which there was intermarriage. So he could see what happened when you bred, so to speak, a Jew and a non-Jew together. And he had a vast collection. It's all in his archives at Cambridge and can be used today. It was a very large body of multi-generational data. And he was particularly interested in the transmission of what he called, or what we would call today, Jewish markers. Because he was aware that, now I'm using the word Jewish in the way Jewish is used conventionally to describe people as Jewish, okay, in an almost stereotypical kind of way. He was aware that not all Jews looked Jewish. But then what were the markers of Jewishness? Now he downplayed, took no interest in any of the usual markers. He wasn't concerned with measuring shapes. He wasn't concerned with eye color, a little bit about nose shape, but not really that much. Stature, hair color. He didn't think any of those were a sign of Jewishness. Rather, he had an interest in, he said the great marker of Jewishness was what he called, and these are his words, the millennia-old Jewish facial expression. Now, I'm going to have to read what he wrote because I can't describe the Jewish facial expression, but he obviously knew what he meant. The nose is often peculiar, not because of its length or even because of its convexity, which may be often outdone in non-Jews, but by the heavy development of the nostrils. The eyes are generally elongated, and a fairly characteristic feature is the length of the upper eyelid. The face, which exhibits the expression of Jewishness, is never of the angular type with square jaw, a type which is extremely rare amongst Jews. Far more usual is to find rounded features, long sloping jaw, fairly developed chin, which is rounded and not square, a good-sized forehead devoid of that angularity in the region of the temples, which is not uncommon amongst Teutonic peoples. Usually after I start reading these descriptions, people start thinking about this, well, how big is my forehead? And they start wondering, do I have the Jewish look? Anyways, that's what it was. Now, I don't have to tell you, you don't have to be a scientist or a physician to know that this is not a rigorous methodology. It's highly subjective. And I want to show you how unrigorous it was. Next slide, please. Good. This is about an experiment, not that he carried out casually. It was almost like an after dinner entertainment that he did at his house at Homestall in January of 1912, when the writer, journalist, and publicist Israel Zangwill, probably the best known Jewish writer at the time, was visiting with Salaman and his wife, and Zangwill's wife, Edith, at Homestall. The Zangwills and the Salamans were quite close. He did 2 rounds of experiments. In the first round, he showed Edith and Israel 63 photographs of mostly male undergraduates, 9 Jews and 54 non-Jews. Zangwill, as you can see, identified 18 non-Jews as Jews. And Nina, excuse me, the first experiment was with Nina Salaman, sorry, with Salaman's wife. And Nina identified 1 Jew as a Gentile. Now, Redcliffe, of course, knew who was who. In the second round, he had 38 photographs. They were evenly divided between Jews and non-Jews. Zangwill identified 11 non-Jews as Jews. And Edith transformed 4 Gentiles into Jews and 6 Jews into Gentiles. So this is so much for the scientific rigor of this method. Now the question is why, because he was interested in transmission. So we started with potatoes. He was interested in how you pass on, so to speak, what we would call good genes, genes that are resistant to blight. So how do Jewish traits get passed on? Why do some Jews exhibit Jewish looks and other Jews, like his brother Clement or like himself, don't? And then this is where he created his biological history of the Jews. Unlike some race scientists, he said the Jews were not a pure race. They were rather a mixture of various peoples that came together in the ancient Middle East, intermarried, bred together, and eventually developed an identity as the Jewish people. Now, if you're familiar with the early biblical accounts, indeed most of them, it makes it quite clear that the original Judeans, the tribes, are intermingling a lot with the people around them. So that part was okay, and that was probably true. Redcliffe Salaman also believed that each of these peoples had its own distinctive look. For example, the Amorites, who we thought contributed to this racial mix, had a fair complexion and red hair, just like the Salaman family. The Philistines, who also intermarried with Jews, were responsible for fine, delicate features among Jews. And they were responsible for what's known as the pseudo-Gentile, non-Semitic components. And there's an irony in his composition of the groups, because about at least half the groups that contributed to the racial mix of the Jews were not Semitic groups. So in a sense, the Jews were only half Semitic and not fully Semitic. And then the Hittites, who we thought were responsible for the nostrility. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, the first one, this is a slide of the Philistines, and you see they have very delicate features, like the Salamans. This is taken from a painting, wall painting in an archaeological dig in Cyprus, Crete, and it was thought that the Philistines came from Crete. And then the next one, please. And this one is a slide of a Hittite, and this is where obviously he thought the nostrility of Jews came from. This fellow, he said, almost looks like a caricature of a Jew. Now, this Hittite, in fact, is not a Hittite. I discovered about 6 weeks ago. I was giving this lecture at the University of Michigan, where I used to teach, and a distinguished Assyriologist in the group stood up and said, "That's not a Hittite." He said, "That's an Assyrian." And I said, "Well, I'm glad to know that, but Redcliffe Salaman thought it was a Hittite, so that's what's important for us." But in any case, I don't want to mislead you. Now, what he said was that all these different groups, and he had other groups that blended together with the early Jewish people, he thought all of this interracial mixing stopped in the 5th century BCE, when Ezra issued his proclamation banning intermarriage. Exact details of that we don't know anything about, but Redcliffe Salaman took it at face value. And then he said, what's interesting, Salaman said, is that even though racial mixing stopped, all of the racial components that went into the Jews were still in play. We're still in their, he didn't have the word genes yet, but we're still in their makeup, their physical makeup. And he then mapped which were dominant and which were recessive. And so, for example, he found that Jewish features are recessive to North European features, while Jewish features are dominant to the pseudo-Gentile type. And you can go on and on in that vein. Now, what this was not greeted with either amusement it was taken seriously. And he spoke to all kinds of Jewish audiences and even published in scientific journals from about 1910 to 1933. 1933, he gave the last public lecture about Jews and their racial origins. And ironically, it was at the Hebrew University where he'd been invited. He was there doing a study of the university for the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University, along with two other persons. And they were investigating how what was wrong with Judah Magnus's management. So he was asked to speak while he was there. This is the lecture he gave, one of his race science lectures. Now, the interesting question to me is not the specific details of his racial thinking. I mean, they're interesting, but rather what this meant to him. Why did he embrace racial thinking? What did it do for him? As people in literature say, what work did Jewish racial science do for him? Now, first I can rule certain things out. He was not interested in classifying races hierarchically. As far as I know, he never did. Like most Britons of the time, he probably thought certain peoples were superior to others, but that didn't enter into his work in any way. He wasn't concerned about that. And in fact, he wasn't really interested in identifying non-physical Jewish characteristics. In other words, what things Jews inherited, aside from the Jewish look, Jewish nostrils, Jewish foreheads, whatever. What about the things, because that's the really dangerous part of racial science, is that what characteristics are thought to derive from one's biological origins. And he wasn't interested in this particularly at all. He gave perfunctory mention to certain things that were common stereotypes at the time. He mentioned the absence of alcoholism among Jews. He mentioned he'd never been on campus and seen a Jewish fraternity on a big gay weekend at an American campus to know that that's not true. He said Jews were excellent in chess, in music, and in mathematics. But people said that all the time. That didn't mean anything. It was commonplace. Rather, I think what really mattered to him, and I don't know how conscious of this he was that racial thinking gave him a way to describe, or rather to be Jewish, without embracing or rooting his Jewishness in a revealed religion, which Judaism is. When Jews, beginning in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then in the Age of Emancipation, had to define themselves for inclusion into state and society, they tended to minimize what their Jewishness to reduce it to simply religion. First of all, before the 18th century, really before the 19th century, most Jews wouldn't have been able to identify what does it mean to be Jewish. Well, are you a race, religion, nation, whatever? Those would have been distinctions that didn't make any difference. What he did was say this old definition that Jews are different from the peoples in whose midst they live simply by virtue of their religion is not true. He said it's patently false. What binds Jews together is their race. And he was scathing, really scathing, about Jews who defined themselves as Englishmen of the Jewish faith, Germans of the Mosaic persuasion, whatever. And many Jews defined themselves, at least formally, in that way in the public arena. And in some ways, I would say that his racial outlook did the same thing for him. It linked him. It gave him a reason to be a Jew, explained why he was a Jew, in the same way that Zionism functioned for secular Jews. Because Zionism said what holds us together is Jewish nationality, not our religion, not the fact that we keep the commandments, not the fact that we received the law at Sinai. And that what's really important is our nationhood. We need to then reconstruct a Jewish state. And I think that what's important about his racial views for him. Now, two things are interesting about his racial thinking, aside from the fact that it didn't go into looking at characteristics of Jews. One was, it did not in any way shape his behavior. That may seem odd, but I'll have to explain what I mean, with one exception. I'll explain the exception. And it didn't have any influence on his historical work, which I'll get to at the end of the lecture. There's an organization that existed in the East End of London that was essentially funded and managed by West London Jews, that was known as the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain. I don't think much has been written about it. Very few of its records survive, but enough to reconstruct some of its history. Salaman was one of the founders of the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain, and its president from 1923 until its formal dissolution after the war in 1946. It was focused on the health and the welfare of the East Europeans, and particularly their children living in the East End. Now, the motives of the founders were mixed. First of all, and most of the founders were medical men. Some of them were just continuing an old established tradition of West End Jews intervening in the affairs of East End Jews to improve their conditions, in part to improve the overall image of the Jews. So that was part of it. That was an old tradition of doing it. So that was one of it. Some of the concerns of people were nationalists. A disproportionate number of the physicians were also Zionists, and they saw it as a way of strengthening the Jewish nation through health, building them up. And these were ideas that usually came from earlier organizations of this sort that were founded in Tsarist Russia and then continued after the collapse of the Tsarist regime in Poland and in Germany. And some of the people, certainly Salaman to some extent, were motivated by eugenicist concerns. This is the one example I have of Salaman's behavior being shaped by his racial views. Now, most of the programs, he was only one person in the organization. He was the president. And it's hard to determine how much was in his initiative or not. Most of the programs of the Jewish Health Organization of Great Britain were in no way connected with eugenics or eugenicist concerns. They published a whole series of health pamphlets in Yiddish and in Hebrew and in English. They sponsored health lectures in the East End, and they dispensed all kinds of practical advice: how to keep a clean house, how to raise your children, how to take care of your children's eyes, how you should discipline your children, things of this sort. And these were really preventive medicine measures. They also tried to improve physical conditions, the environments in the Talmud Torahs, and to a lesser extent in the Chadarim. That is, all the Talmud Torahs, almost elementary Jewish education in the East End, the religious establishments were known for the poor ventilation, for their unsanitary conditions, for the lack of adequate lighting, etc. And so they tried to improve these. The organization also provided health inspectors for the state schools in the East End that had large Jewish enrollments. Its most lasting contribution was that it established the first children's mental health clinic in Great Britain. It was dependent upon a multidisciplinary approach where people from different disciplines would treat a child with problems from different perspectives. So an occupational therapist, an MD, and a psychologist might get together to work with a child. This was pioneering in the English context, less so in the American context at the time. And this child clinic still continues. It broke away from, it continued after the Jewish Health Organization collapsed. It's now known as the Emanuel J. Miller Children's Health or Mental Health Clinic. I'm not sure the exact wording. And it's named after its first director, Emanuel Miller, who was the father, interestingly, of the polymath Jonathan Miller. In any case, the one time in which Redcliffe began to think in eugenicist terms through the framework of the Jewish Health Organization, Great Britain, is in the mid-1930s. He thought it was necessary to establish a register of young Jews of marriageable age in the East End in order to discourage marriage of healthy Jews to mentally unstable Jews or mentally deficient Jews or troubled Jews, however you want to manage it. Now, he claimed that Jews were so concerned with marriage that they often ignored the shortcomings, mental, underlying emotional concerns in one of the parties, because they wanted to get their children married. And they would arrange marriages, in some case, one healthy person to one unhealthy person. So he imagined, he never worked this out in any detail. This was really a eugenicist project. It went nowhere, nothing was done. I think there was also a connection to his own family with this, because it's interesting that he had a brother, Archibald, who was committed to an insane asylum, a private mental health home, where he reigned most of his life. And he also had a much younger brother, Harry, who committed suicide a few years after he graduated from Cambridge. So in this sense, there may have been some personal interest that made him particularly concerned about how these kind of racial misfits, so to speak, crept into the Jewish people. But in general, his racial thinking was compartmentalized. And the best example I can think of is to take his great historical work. In 1949, Redcliffe Salaman published a great work of social history, a volume of 700 pages called The History and Social Influence of the Potato. This was, again, a pioneer work. Today, there are many works on single commodities or foodstuffs, history of sugar, history of whatever. You can find many of them being published by social historians today. He did this long before it became even popular. And he was also interested on its social influence, that is to say, how it affected history, particularly in the case of Ireland. He published it in 1949, and one marker of its value is it has never been out of print since then. I don't know if one wants to label it a bestseller, but it's still being sold, still being printed in its more or less original edition. There's a few extra footnotes have been added by later scientists, but its value as a work. Now, what's interesting about the work, first of all, is that he would even try it. Today, if a historian would try to do such a work, he would be warned away from it, because the work draws upon the history of science, the history of biology, ethnology, anthropology, archaeology, the history of empire, and biology. No one is a master of that today. Redcliffe Salaman belonged to that segment of society that was confident in its own abilities. I think he was one of these people who would probably never admit he was wrong, and probably thought he could do, I won't say most anything, but thought he could proceed with this. Only somebody with a tremendous amount of chutzpah could have undertaken this kind of book. No historian would today, but it is a marvelous book. The amazing thing is, given his record as a race science, is there's nothing about races in it. And it deals with two groups that are thought of as, three groups really, that were thought of as races: the Irish, the English, and the Jews. He never once refers to the Irish as a race. He never talks about their behavior, particularly the peasantry who suffered so much, as in any way shaped by their race. He shows them being shaped by their foodstuffs, by material circumstances, by their dependence on the potato. He traces in great detail how the potato was introduced to Europe, how it was introduced to Ireland, and how it gained a foothold. And then when the blight occurs, how it wreaks havoc with Ireland. But none of this is attributed to race. The bad behavior of the English, and he was that unusual upper middle class Englishman who was bitterly anti-English about their behavior in the mid-19th century toward Ireland. He never attributes that to any kind of racial behavior. Now, I also think, and I talk about this in the book, that there's a kind of Jewish undercurrent to this chapter, or rather to the book, because at many places he compares the Irish and the Jews as, if you will, long-suffering peoples. Who causes the great long-suffering of the Irish? Well, we know the answer, it's the English. And in the case of the Jews, he saw the English as the oppressors of the Jews because they were not keeping the promises they'd made in the Balfour Declaration. He really thought of Albion, the British government, as perfidious Albion. He was serving in the Jewish Legion in Palestine at the time, and he thought the British simply reneged on all their promises and turned and didn't use, in fact, the Jewish Legion as a force to help build up the growing state. So in this way, though, he could think clearly when he wasn't dealing with racial issues, and only on these other things did he have it. And I've tried to explain what the function of it was for him. Okay, I think we have some time for some questions now. How are we going to do this?
Thank you. Okay, so Zoom audience, you can put your question in the chat or raise your hand. And Tony will share the Q&A.
Right, so we have some questions, 3 questions. So I think I think I've got to come around with the mic. So.
Thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. I was interested in your point about Salaman's proposal to create this directory of Jewish individuals to prevent kind of, I guess, medically irresponsible marriages.
Right.
And I wondered whether what you thought he might think of how this is actually happening now. There's charities called Jewishness, which encourage testing of individuals before they get married, especially in the Ashkenazi communities, to prevent genetic recessive diseases and things like that. And so I wondered whether you thought that that might be something that he would have approved of, or whether it doesn't count in the same way.
He wasn't concerned with physical ill diseases. He was concerned with what we would call emotional states, mental health. But I can't answer the question because I don't think he could imagine the state of genetics, the ability to detect, passing on diseases, Tay-Sachs, etc. So it's really impossible for me to answer how he would have thought.
Fair enough.
Science moves so much faster in the second half of the 20th century.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you.
Can I also say thank you? It was fascinating. Can you tell us, when he talked about the Jewish race, what awareness was there of Ashkenazi and Sephardi, of the various subsects within that? Did he believe that we were all from the same single stock? And if you like, if DNA testing had been available in his time, we would all have come out with more or less the same results?
he did believe, when you said that they came out of the same pot, it was a melting pot of all these early peoples. Because he said the Jews were not a pure race. Now, there was no intermarriage, he said, more or less, after the 5th century BCE. But he did recognize the different branches, but that wasn't a problem for him. I mean, he knew Sephardim, he knew he was Ashkenazi, but it didn't factor into it. If anything, he thought some of the Sephardi claims that he would hear in London from members of Bevis Marx about their blue blood or aristocratic, descent, that was a little far-fetched. But he saw that it was just snobbery. But he didn't really have any, he didn't see any genetic difference, if you want to put it that way. But he doesn't use the word about genes. That's post his time.
Thank you.
Yes, it was a lovely story, and that was a lovely story and an intriguing book. But you, as a historian, look at it, and it hasn't got scientific credibility. His observations are subjective. In your expression, how does it work for you?
I'm sorry.
Why have you? What fascinates you about the book, other than it's just a sort of a fascinating thing? But in what way does it contribute to your learning?
First of all, the book itself. This is only one chapter in the book. Okay, it's a biography. He did many things. It's a chapter on the potato book. Anyways, various things. But what interests me is why he did it, how he got to that point. And what it did for him is it gave him a way of thinking about being Jewish. That was for a secular Jew, and that he reflected the pervasive claims of his time. He wasn't the only one in Britain. There were other physicians who said the same thing, but they didn't do this elaborate research. In fact, some of them thought his research was rather slipshod. So is that the question you were asking? I'm not.
Yeah, well, it's what. So in the sort of envelope of learning that you have, what have you what have you actually profited from it as the progress?
Oh, well, if you study his life,
Yeah.
you learn a great deal that was actually very unique about English Jewry. You learn about all kinds of incidents, for example, that just would not be available otherwise. You learn how it was possible to live in the country and maintain a Jewish identity. His wife, Nina Salaman, who was an important translator of medieval Hebrew poetry, taught her children to read Hebrew in Barley, in their country home, before she taught them to read English. You learned about his contacts with other people. You learned about a sector of Anglo-Jewry, let me call it, there is a university-educated or Jewish intelligentsia in Britain of which he was a member. We know about an earlier generation, the so-called wanderers. From his time, we don't, but there are people who were affiliated with it. We learn about them and what they did, how they were active, and the obstacles they faced. And also, he fought battles that are still being fought today. I didn't go into this all. This is why I lectured at the Jewish Museum in London. He spent a good part of his life, at least from the 1920s on, fighting an obscurantist religious right within Judaism. He would have been, first of all, he would recognize the scene immediately today, the way in which certain Jews have been persecuted, including the so-called greatest chief rabbi Britain ever had, and all of the kinds of fights and the intransigence of the far right, of the Dayanim and the United Synagogue. he had these things, and he fought with the chief rabbi and befriended the chief rabbi, but he was always opposed to that. And he said they spend too much time drawing borders. He stood for what's called what I would call a big tent Judaism. He wasn't interested in defining who's in, who's out, because he had another way of saying Jews are all together. They belong to the same group, which certainly powerful segments in Anglo-Jewry today do not believe that. So that's probably, but he didn't succeed. For example, he had a scheme. He said he saw a problem. But one of the problem was, I'm going to use the word rabbi, although they weren't rabbis, they were reverends. They didn't have smicha. But he said the rabbis of our time, meaning the 20s, teens, 20s, are inadequate. They can't speak to their congregations. They don't speak the same language, not literally, but conceptually. They're from poor immigrant homes or lower middle class homes. They don't have much secular education. They're like the Chabad rabbis today who staff the United Synagogue shuls. And he would say, we have to change this. We must bring a Judaism in that will involve people. And they will speak to people who are, in a sense, as educated, or really more educated, at least secularly, than they are. And so he and Robert Whaley Cohen developed a scheme, and some others, to move Jews College to Oxford or Cambridge, where it would become a postgraduate college, and that all who attended it would first attend an Oxford or Cambridge college and acquire the veneer and the substance of a gentleman's education. And that was a way of moving away from what he saw and moving more into Western culture. So he was appalled by the behavior of a lot of the Jews in his time. And I give many more examples in the book. So for all these reasons, he's a fascinating individual. And I said the case is, look, Jews are still trying to decide who they are. They're still fighting about that. They're still fighting about who's in and who's out in religious terms. These are still issues today, unresolved, for which I do not see any quick resolution.
We've got 5 questions at the moment from this magic box. We've got first one from my colleague Joan Tumblety. Thank you for a wonderful paper. This is a really obvious question, but could you say something about how Salaman responded to the use that others in his lifetime were putting the notion that Jews were a race, i.e. anti-Semites?
Well, he as I said, after 1933, he no longer spoke publicly about Jews as a race. Moreover, he had never attributed any characteristics to that biological descent, which would mark him off greatly from the people who lived in race who were on the continent. And of course, he was, terribly upset. He worked very hard, first of all, against the British Union of Fascists. He worked terribly hard to save scientists and professional men who came to Britain, etc. So there was nothing contradictory about his behavior. However, there's one tiny reference to race late in his life. He gave a lecture to the Anglo-Jewish Association sometime in the early 1950s, in which he compared the Jewish people to a troika. And he said, the Jews are a troika. What's driving them is nationality, religion, and race. And that's all he said. So he would say there's a biological component, there's a national component, and there's a religious component. That was hedging his bets. I mean, that was not a very radical statement. And I would guess if you believed in something all your life, you could never give it up completely. Eric Hobsbawm never renounced communism, even after he saw the horrible effect it had in China and Russia. So if you believe something your whole life, you don't always give it up so easily.
Okay, we have 2 quite specific questions, which we'll take together. First one from Gillian Walker, you mentioned that he was influenced by Bateson. Was that Gregory or Sir William, and what did he take from either of them? And then from Richard Bloor, thank you so much, Professor Endelman, for this fascinating talk. I wonder, was Salaman using the photographs taken by Joseph Jacobs for Francis Galton?
You probably had seen the photographs, but he wasn't interested in individual physical characteristics, so he didn't go about matters that way. But I'm sure you see them. He didn't use them in any of his work, but he certainly would have been aware of them. Although I came across in his archives no copies of them. And what was the first question? Was about Bateson?
Mm-hmm.
What was the question?
So was he influenced? He was influenced by Bateson. Was that Gregory or Sir William?
William Bateson.
And what did he take from Bateson?
Well, he was Mendelian. It was Bateson who brought Mendel to the certainly attention of the scientific world in England.
Mm-hmm. It's a question from Joseph Finley. In his latter years, did Salaman have anything to say on Verticommon's race in Britain in the post-Second World War era, with reference to, say, new Commonwealth migration?
No.
No. And going down the list, Irene Elia, sort of related to one of the first earlier questions, but did he see the dangers of race thinking for the Jews in discrimination and persecution of the Jews in pogroms and later the Holocaust?
In light of the Holocaust.
What during and in light of?
Well, I mean, he never wrote, there's a sound, racial thinking was widespread and respectable at least before 1933. So it wasn't a problem then for him. Afterwards, it would be, but he doesn't write much about race in general really after 1933. So he doesn't point out the use of race, or rather the use of race and inherited characteristics as an element in anti-Semitism, because he's not writing about it. So that's all I can say about that.
And I think, yes, there's two more. Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. This is from Roxy Moore. Would you be able to reflect on how, or indeed if, his views on race affected his post-war humanitarian work?
I don't think it did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remember, he after the war, first of all, his health declined during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And after the war, I think he did, between, let's say, 45 and 48, 49, he devoted himself chiefly. He was an older man by then. He would have been in his late 70s and early 80s. So he devoted himself to writing the history and social influence of the potato. And I don't think he was much involved in humanitarian affairs by the time he gets to the 1950s. He dies in 1955. He kept abreast of what was happening, but he did not, he couldn't take any kind of role. I mean, he wasn't that well.
And the last one we've got on the screen is Harvin Judy. Could you comment about Salaman and anthropology?
Well, he never studied anthropology as a subject. Of course, it wasn't a subject when he was at university. It was in the process of becoming. He knew a very eminent anthropologist, Charles Seligman, because his sister Brenda was married to him. And the extent to which he drew upon Seligman for information, I just don't know.
Could I just ask a comment, add a comment to that? About 20 years ago, I heard a lecture by a very eminent American anthropologist called Sidney Mintz, who is no longer with us, who is known for his study of sugar cane and the worldwide implication of that particular plant in industry, commerce, and so forth, and health. And he started off his lecture. It was a lecture to anthropologists about mentioning Salaman's work on potatoes. He says most people don't know about this, but he says this is one of the foundations of our field. This overall approach, starting with the potato and then getting into so many other levels and social implications of it. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, the interesting thing, he published the lecture, but in a rather, not an obscure, but a small journal. And he was probably the first to recognize Salaman's contribution. But I think it was really historians who've carried on that tradition much more, of writing about a single foodstuff and its impact in various environments.
Could I ask about his relationship with James Parks and their sort of neighbours? The Parks, through his work in the 1920s, and he'd seen sort of race science in action and the sort of racialization of university world. Did they talk about race at all? Did they, what was their relationship?
If they talked about it, they didn't write about it.
Mm-hmm.
All of those of Salaman's grandchildren who are still alive and remember him, always remember him and James Parks going off on long walks.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume that was nothing new. The only time you find real exchanges in print about them is when they were cooperating in various ventures, either pro-refugee, anti-British Union fascists. And then there was one affair that Parks got very, well, excuse me, he and Parks also worked together, and there is some correspondence on this, to get rid of a pedophile priest in Barley. And then they worked closely on that because they were the two chief men in the village, essentially. And then later in 1953, one of the last public things that Salaman did was to deliver the Lucian Wolff lecture to the Jewish Historical Society of England. And in it, he managed to offend the Chief Rabbi Brodie, who was there, and many other members in the audience. Not all of them, some were cheering for him, not literally. But various things he said that were true, I think, but people didn't want to hear the truth. And then there was a huge dispute within the Council of the Jewish Historical Society of England about whether they would print the Lucian Wolff lecture without him making serious changes to it. Parks was president at the time. The issue that most alarmed them was what Salaman had to say about Shkita. Now, I won't go into the details on that. Parks, as you know, had no particular interest one way or another about, what Jews eat and how their meat is killed. But he did not want the Historical Society to be ripped apart by this. So he did his best to make peace between the two sides. Some people acted honorably. Some people acted dishonorably. You have to read the book to find who acted dishonorably. But in the end, they published it, but he did take some of the sting, a little bit of the sting out. That lecture, though, which is no longer in print, but is available, is the single best description of how the Anglo-Jewish community, particularly at the leadership level of West End Jewry, functioned under the cousinhood or under the old regime, or whatever we want to call it, up until World War I and even beyond. He was the first to write about it, and he offered a beautiful description. That's part of what attracted me to him.
Are there any more questions from the real people here? Okay, and I think we've answered all the questions online. So just remains to me to thank Todd for a fascinating, beautifully delivered lecture. I'm really eager as ever to read the book, which has just come out, so available from all good booksellers and Amazon, no doubt. But it's got a beautiful illustration, which we've seen on screen. So it's great to see Todd again, his wife Judy with us. Thanks for coming here, and thanks for everyone for coming tonight and to celebrate the wonderful contribution that Howard Rein made to the Parks Institute and for helping us in that process. Thank you very much.
Everybody, and we will put in the chat information about the next seminars and research and lectures from the Parks Institute. So in 2 weeks' time, we will have the interfaith lecture delivered by Rob Thompson about afterbirth and Christian encounters with Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust. We will also have an interesting event about Jewish libraries, so a roundtable. It will be online, and also an event about early Jewish, or research seminar about early Jewish parables in December, and a joint event with history about rumors during the Second World War. So please join, register, and see you soon. Bye-bye.